Didn't he ask you to carry the bill?
Was my campaign manager, and he asked me one day to go to lunch with his good friend George DeQ, who was the owner of the Zephyrs, and the three of us had lunch, and he said, you know, we can get a Major League Baseball team. Every year we keep asking at the meetings why we can't have a baseball team, and they say, well, the first thing is you're in too small a market and you can't support one. And Neil and I said, well, what would it take? And John said, well, you got to have a stadium. I said, we got a stadium. He said, no, you got to have a baseball only stadium. And at that time we also had the Broncos Stadium, which was about to expire. And I said, well, maybe we can piggyback on that and use the same tax, because we can't get a straight out tax passed, that's for certain. And so John and Neil and I said, well, could we run a bill? And this was at the beginning of the session, as I recall. And but I remember vividly sitting at that lunch in the fall. It was a nice day, I remember that. And they said, well, do you think you could do that? I said, no, I can't do that, but I can get you a sponsor that's good, that can. And they said, well, okay, who you got in mind? And then Neil and I waited a few more weeks until we got Kathy Williams to agree to sponsor the bill. And we needed somebody in the Senate who was a opponent of taxes generally, but that would give it legitimacy. And that's how we got to Terry Considine. And the problem primarily that we had going through the House first was that the Speaker was pretty much opposed to the bill, and yet the Speaker and I worked well together, and even after he triple assigned the bill, which means that it went to 3 different committees, between Kathy and me working in the background, the bill had a chance. And the bill was not wildly in favor in the Senate either. Part of the dynamics were that if you were going to have a taxing district that encompassed the suburban counties, each one of the suburban counties was not in favor of giving Denver another piece of infrastructure without a large amount of say in how the tax money was going to be spent. So you had that dynamic in the metro area, and then of course you had the outstate legislators who really could care less one way or the other. So you really had to make it a truly Colorado effort. And that's why the Colorado Rockies are called the Colorado Rockies, because you had to get the support of outstate legislators. You had to get support of the metro legislators. And then when the vote occurred, you had to get everybody in the metro taxing district to understand that this was going to be their team also. But that was the dynamics of getting votes in the legislature. Then the mechanics of having a campaign plus ownership by everyone in the metropolitan area was a key to passing the bill. That's how you came up with the Stadium District Board that had members appointed by the governor, by the Speaker, by the President of the Senate, and then you had representatives from each one of the metropolitan counties. And so later on, after the bill passed, I was appointed by the Speaker to be on the Colorado Baseball Commission. And after we had the appointments of that group, you then had to run a campaign, and you had to get people that knew how to run a campaign. So we hired Rick Ryder to run the campaign, but I became the campaign chairman because I had run a lot of campaigns. and so Rick and I primarily ran the mechanics of the election, including getting the money that was necessary to have the campaign, getting all of the different constituencies to buy in. You had to make sure you had minority representation. You had to make sure that natural advocates for baseball, such as Latinos, were well represented, and you had Z. Ferrofino on the board, and then you had the dynamics after the after the measure passed, and everyone was kind of surprised that it passed, especially as well as it did. Then you still had to convince Major League Baseball that the state of Colorado, or the time zone that was without baseball, was going to support baseball. And they needed to see corporate ownership that was substantial, that wasn't fly-by-night. And so Governor Romer solicited support from outstate owners. But the key, I think, to having baseball approved here was to get Coors sponsorship and Coors involved. And the interesting dynamic there was that in my law practice, I was representing Coors on water matters, and both Pete and Jeff were people that I knew personally, and we had discussions about why they should sponsor the stadium and why they should own part of the team. And I think the key there was that the competition between Coors and Budweiser, you could always say to them, well, there's Busch Stadium, what's wrong with Coors Stadium? And finally, even though they said to me, look, we sell beer, we aren't interested in baseball, we don't know anything about it. And ultimately, we and the governor and many other civic-minded folks prevailed on them to be a major part of the ownership, along with Jerry McMorris. And so then you had a bid that was possible, but you still had to prove its viability, and the viability had to come by selling season tickets. And we wound up in advance selling, what was it, 25,000 or 30,000 season tickets. And then baseball had to allow us how maybe we could have a team. That's a summary of my involvement, I guess.
So I have noted a couple of questions, and my first question goes around the environment of the legislature in the years in which you and I served. And in those years, we had a pretty comfortable majority of Republicans in the House and a pretty comfortable majority of Republicans in the Senate. But there was this great no tax for any reason
Yes.
Feeling, and Colorado Union of Taxpayers certainly did a yearly analysis.
Yeah.
And do you think that had any impact on some of the outstate legislators in their willingness or unwillingness to support the legislation?
Sure, but that's exactly why from the outset it was just an extension of an existing tax. I don't think you would have passed a new tax. And it wasn't just Colorado. If you recall, part of our pitch was that no state or no municipality had passed a baseball stadium only tax increase in the preceding 20 years. So you were not in the era when sports teams could command the same kind of input on taxes that they do now. It was a different time.
Well, we were in a recession at that point in time.
Exactly, we were in a recession. Now, part of the pitch that you and I made was, well, we'll get our money back because you'll have increased sales tax, and of course, look at what's happened to downtown Denver. So I'm sure Mayor Pena at that time had a good vision. I disagreed with him on where the stadium should be, but it proved to be an ideal spot. So, you know, that vision helped. But part of the pitch we made was that you're in a recession. Only the people in the metropolitan area are going to pay the tax, and they're the ones that are going to get the sales tax benefit from this new enterprise. So, yeah, the outstate people were not motivated, let's put it that way. And certainly the people from Colorado Springs, I had several discussions with the people from Colorado Springs saying that I was going to be pushing for the stadium to be in the south part of the metro area because that's where I represented. And, you know, I was going to say, look, it'll be equal distance from Colorado Springs to Denver. So that's the kind of dynamic that we had.
So if I remember correctly, Chris, at that same time, you were working with Dr. Cog on a 2020 plan in
Yes.
terms of metro cooperation and those kinds of things. And I know early on there were a lot of discussions about where is the stadium going to be. And at least in my district, because of the heartburn over the airport, there was this feeling that, you know, we're all going to pay for something that economically enhances Denver. And I know we were all out making public presentations. Was that kind of the feeling of your district too? Or?
Yes. One of the good allies, it turned out after the bill passed, was Commissioner Christensen from Douglas County, who had a vision that cooperation still was going to benefit everyone in the metro area. And finally, that was a big factor in getting things passed, because you know, you could basically say, why not try this? It's not a new tax. It's going to be just an extension, and it's going to go for infrastructure. You know, if it had been for programs, it would have never passed. But it was for unique infrastructure. We had just, like you said, we had just passed a new airport bill. At that same time, I was working, which is a primary reason why I told Neil I couldn't be the sponsor. I was sponsoring a push to get the Winter Olympics here. So you had this cooperation from many business folks about trying things new to get the economy jump-started. And, you know, we had Channel 4, Roger Ogden, as the chairman of the push to get the Winter Olympics, and we made our bid in in Iowa, where the chairman of the U.S. Olympic Committee had his law practice, and we got aced out by Utah, but that's another story. But at the time, you had several of these initiatives that involved economic development, down payments, and baseball was one of them.
So I know that we ended up having some issues after the bill passed, and a couple of those, and we were awarded a team. And I don't know if you were around the legislature at that time when we had to go back and do some things. One thing that we had to do before we were awarded a team is we had to escalate when the election was going to be. We had to move it from a general to a primary.
Yeah.
And so is there anything that you know about in terms of trying to bring that legislation forward that was problematic, or criticism that you heard, or?
Well, you know, they kept changing the rules, and fortunately, after the bill passed and you got people on board and you got this buy-in from the Metro group that was all represented on the baseball commission, those fix-it pieces of legislation I don't think were as contentious. I wasn't there then because I was retiring, if you will, but I was running the campaign at that time along with Rick Ryder, and so you had a lot of support from not only chambers of commerce, city and county of Denver, but also from the governor's office. I mean, we had come that far, we weren't going to mess it up with some technicality about the date.
Well, I know one of the problems that we ended up having is, even though my background was real estate, Terry Considine's background was real estate, he took eminent domain out of the bill when it got to the Senate.
Right.
So, were you around when we tried to put eminent domain back in the bill?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
What, in the campaign, you were involved in that obviously a lot. Was that, and you've done a lot of campaigns, how does that contrast to other campaigns that you did?
The biggest contrast was it, unlike most campaigns where you have polarized points of view, people had to be educated. You really had to make people understand that this was a possibility. You started from ground zero. I mean, this issue basically came on the public as, what? You know, we thought we had a baseball team. It's called the Zephyrs. And to make the leap of telling people that it could be real, and all they had to do was, as Kathy said, show up in a primary where you have very low turnout and have the date change fairly quickly. You really, it was almost like a Chamber of Commerce boosterism that you had to go out and get people to come to the polls. And remember, you didn't have mail-in ballots then. You had to get people to come to the polls,
right,
to vote for baseball. So the campaign theme had to revolve around pride in Colorado and the fact that we ought to do something special. The money was not that much of a problem to raise, but it was a different campaign in that there was nobody generally opposed. I mean, it was, I mean, part of the theme was baseball and motherhood and apple pie. I mean, you know, who could be against baseball? But the real challenge was to make people come to the polls and believe in the possibility. It was very much like the movie Build It and They Will Come, and we would have used that except that somebody else used that.
So you're a baseball fan. Did you get season tickets, and are you still a
yeah.
baseball fan?
Yeah, I have had baseball season tickets forever, but after I guess 20 years, I finally haven't renewed them, but that's not because of my dislike of baseball.
Seems like I had a question now, it's kind of slipped my mind. I know one of the other things that we had talked about is or some provisions of the bill, I want to know how important you felt they are, is that we would not build a stadium even though Tampa St. Petersburg had built a stadium until we were awarded a team.
Correct. That was very important. I mean, again, it went back to the underlying theme, which is you had to describe a possibility for the voters, and on the other hand, you had to describe a possibility for Major League Baseball, because they didn't believe we could get it done. I mean, you know, Neil and a few others thought it was possible, but you started from zero. There was zero interest when we started, and so those safeguards I thought were reasonable. I mean, they made it tougher ultimately, but I think they also enabled us to pass the bill finally.
So I know one of the criticisms that I had received was, you're gonna build an economic engine for Denver and we're all gonna pay for it, and it was especially
Yeah.
a sore point in Adams County because of the airport and jobs and that type of thing. So we decided to put revenue sharing into the bill. Do you think that was a key point or no?
I think that was a key point, and also the fact that the stadium site was not mandated in the bill. As I said, I represented Arapahoe County, and I made a pitch to put the stadium out by where the Broncos practice facility is, and it was a key not to have Denver designated. Now, Denver and everybody assumed that it would be in Denver, but that was a key part of the bill.
So you think if it had been in there that it was Denver, it may not have
It
passed?
definitely would not have passed. I have no doubt about it. Yeah.
So one of the other provisions in the bill that I'm also curious about is we received some criticism that we had a baseball commission in the bill, and that was it right or fair that a group that would be out promoting a tax increase and yet still be protecting the taxpayers, and that's where we decided to have the Stadium District Board and the Baseball Commission. Do you think that was important, or do you think it was?
I think it was genius, because you had to have a permanent stadium district board to monitor the expenditure of the funds, but they had no purpose if you couldn't pass the vote. And so you needed this boosterism of the commission to show the metro area and to show the state, really, that there was broad-based support for the concept. And again, we were talking about a campaign where you really had to educate people, A, that it was possible, and B, that we as a time zone, or we as Colorado, deserved it. So you really needed this, I'd call it a mini Chamber of Commerce approach, where you had a commission that was strictly in charge of promoting baseball.
So two other provisions of the bill. One was that the tax would go away once the bonds were retired.
Yeah.
And the other was a target of privatization for naming rights and advertising and parking. Do you think that was important or not important, or?
It was a key for Major League Baseball to have the understanding that this was going to be Coors Field. It was never spoken, it was never discussed in the legislation, but you could see around Major League Baseball that naming rights were getting to be very key, and you of course weren't going to establish a government entity that had naming rights, Metropolitan Stadium or whatever. It had to be somebody that had financial incentive to put in a lot of money to fund the stadium.
I think
That's
that
all the
sounds great.
All the questions I
Yeah, I think
I
I'm
have.
You've got these questions right at the tip. I mean, you guys have done a tremendous amount of work, and you're to be
There's a
congratulated.
little bit more to do yet.
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
there's still a tremendous amount to be done.
But we're making progress now that Kathy's retired. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
You can turn off the.
And I'm not doing, yeah.